Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine this scenario for a second. You're a U.S. citizen, just, living your life, and suddenly you find yourself getting questioned, maybe even held. Or worse, tangled up in procedures that are actually designed only for people who aren't citizens. It sounds, well, maybe impossible, but it's a real concern, and it's right at the heart of this government report we're diving into today.
That's exactly right. Our source here is a recent report from the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, and they did a really detailed investigation looking specifically into claims from people saying, hey, I'm a U.S. citizen, but they were mistakenly targeted by immigration enforcement actions from ICE Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and also CBP Customs and Border Protection.
Right. And our job right now, our mission, is to really cut through this dense report for you, our listener. We want to zero in on the most critical findings,
Right.
understand the policies that are supposed to stop this, see what the data actually tells us about how often it might be happening,
Yeah.
and crucially, the big question marks around that data,
Yeah.
and just figure out what it all means. We're doing this deep dive so you can get a quick, clear handle on what's really important here.
Okay, so first things first, let's cover the fundamental issue, administrative immigration enforcement. It's based on civil violations of immigration law. And this is key. These charges, the actions like detention or removal, they apply only to foreign nationals, people who are considered removable under the law, U.S. citizens. They're simply not subject to this kind of administrative enforcement, period.
Seems straightforward enough, right? In theory. But actually determining if someone is a U.S. citizen. Well, the report really highlights how complex that can be. It's not always just showing a passport. I mean, it's not just where you were born. Your citizenship can hinge on your parents' history, maybe when and where they were citizens, or details about your birth, military service, the whole naturalization process. It's layered, lots of specific legal criteria.
Absolutely. It's definitely not always a simple yes-no question. Far from it sometimes. So how did the GAO actually tackle investigating this complex issue? Well, they looked at the written policies, the procedures used by both ICE and CBP, and that includes specific parts of those agencies, like ICE's ERO enforcement and removal operations, and CBP's Office of Field Operations, OFO, that's the folks at ports of entry, and of course the U.S. Border Patrol.
And they didn't just read the manuals, right? They dug into the data. They analyzed enforcement records from both agencies, covering what, about 5 years, fiscal 2015 through mid-2020. Plus, they talked to people, interviewed officials at headquarters, out in the field offices, trying to get the real-world picture.
Exactly. A pretty thorough approach. So looking at the policies first, the report found ICE does have policies that lay out steps for officers, steps to take if they encounter someone, or maybe they're thinking about issuing a detainer. That request to another police department to hold someone, if there's a question about whether that person might actually be a U.S. citizen, the policy describes a process. Factual checks, getting reviews, deciding what to do next.
Okay, but here's a snag the report points out, right? A pretty significant one. While the policy exists on paper, GAO found that ICE's training materials, what officers actually learn, were inconsistent with that policy. Specifically about needing to notify supervisors when they encounter someone and suspect potential U.S. citizenship. So the rulebook says one thing, but the training might not hammer it home the same way, or maybe it's less clear.
Yeah, that gap between the official policy and the field training is definitely noteworthy. And maybe even more critical is what GAO found about how ICE tracks all this, or rather, how they don't track it systematically. ICE apparently doesn't have a consistent way to collect electronic data, specifically on encounters where they find probative evidence. That's basically strong, convincing evidence suggesting U.S. citizenship. Officers can, type notes in a narrative field somewhere in the record, but they aren't required to formally update the main citizenship field in the electronic system to United States based on finding that evidence.
Huh. So they might jot down, hey, this person provided a birth certificate or something. But the main computer record doesn't necessarily get changed right then and there to show U.S. citizen in a way you can easily query or track.
Exactly. It's not systematically captured in a searchable field. And ICE officials actually told the GAO they acknowledged that this makes it really hard, maybe impossible even, to track systematically how often they encounter, arrest, detain, or remove someone where they later found this strong evidence of citizenship. They just can't easily run a report and say, okay, show us all the cases where this happened.
Wow, okay. That's a major, major data gap right there. What about CBP then? The people working at airports, land borders.
Yeah.
The Office of Field Operations, OFO.
Right, OFO. They also have procedures. If a traveler comes through primary inspection and their citizenship isn't immediately clear, they get referred to secondary inspection. More checks happen there. Officers will do sworn statements, run database checks, that kind of thing. Now, the OFO data GAO looked at, it showed millions of times U.S. citizens were referred to secondary, millions, and tens of thousands of instances where U.S. citizens were actually held and processed for some kind of enforcement action.
Whoa, wait. Tens of thousands of times a U.S. citizen was held and processed for enforcement. That sounds like a lot.
It does sound like a big number, yeah. But here's the absolutely crucial data limitation the report points out for CBP data. It doesn't specify if those enforcement actions actually involved administrative immigration violations. Remember, those are the civil charges only meant for foreign nationals. The report says these actions against citizens could have been, say, arrests for criminal stuff, smuggling, maybe, or it could involve holding minors until they can be released to a guardian, things like that. So while citizens were held, the data doesn't clearly tell us how many, if any, were mistakenly processed as if they were foreign nationals for administrative immigration reasons.
Okay, got it. So the number is big, but the reason why they were held isn't specifically tracking the mistake we're focused on here. What about Border Patrol then? The agents operating between the official ports of entry.
Border Patrol, right. They also encounter and arrest U.S. citizens. Often it's related to criminal activity like drug smuggling or human trafficking near the border. And similar to OFO, the report found a key data limitation in the Border Patrol systems. Their main system, apparently, doesn't allow them to easily identify if agents held and processed a U.S. citizen specifically on administrative immigration charges. Now, the system does have controls. It's supposed to prevent an agent from charging someone already marked as a U.S. citizen with an immigration violation. But if someone is initially processed as maybe a foreign national and then later identified as a citizen, that correction might just end up in, again, those narrative notes, not in a structured data field that lets the agency track how often that kind of mistaken initial processing happens.
So for both CBP's OFO and Border Patrol, the computer systems just aren't really set up to isolate this specific scenario.
Yeah.
The scenario where a U.S. citizen gets incorrectly processed for an administrative immigration violation, something only for non-citizens. We can see they interact with citizens, they hold citizens, but the data doesn't cleanly separate out why in a way that flags this particular kind of error.
Exactly. That's a really core finding about the data limitations across the board. Now, even with those limitations, the GAO did manage to pull some numbers related to individuals whose records, at some point, were updated to indicate potential U.S. citizenship. So looking at ICE data, specifically ERO, from fiscal year 2015 through early 2020.
Okay, what did they find there? They found ICE's ERO made at least 674 arrests of people where the data later showed potential U.S. citizenship. The report points out this was less than 1% of all the arrests the ERO made in that time frame. And these individuals, mostly male, typically between 19 and 45 years old, and many already had some kind of record, either criminal or previous immigration encounters.
Right. Moving beyond arrests, they found at least 121 individuals booked into ICE detention whose records later indicated potential U.S. citizenship. About a fifth of these people were actually first picked up by CBP and then handed over to ICE. Again, more than half had some kind of prior criminal or immigration history. These detentions happen most often in the areas around Los Angeles and Phoenix, and for about half of these detained individuals, their detention ended because the government basically dropped the case, terminated the immigration proceedings.
And removals. Did they find instances of people potentially being U.S. citizens who were actually removed from the country?
Yes. The report identified at least 70 individuals removed by ICE whose data indicated potential U.S. citizenship. About two-thirds of those, again, were initially apprehended by CBP. Like the others, most had a prior history, criminal or immigration. Most of these removals originated from the San Diego area.
Okay, so 674 arrests,
Yeah.
121 detentions, 70 removals, where the record eventually showed potential U.S. citizenship. But there's that huge caveat you mentioned earlier, right, about the timing.
Absolutely vital caveat. For all these ICE numbers, the report stresses this. The data shows potential U.S. citizenship because the citizenship field was updated to United States at some point. Could have been during the investigation, could have been after. Crucially, the report says this update might have happened after the enforcement action. The arrest, the detention, even the removal was already completed. The data just doesn't tell us when that citizenship status was confirmed relative to the action.
Right, okay. So while the record, looking back, shows potential citizenship, we don't actually know from this data if ICE knew that before they arrested, detained, or removed the person. So these numbers show situations where someone who might have been a citizen went through these processes. But the data isn't sharp enough to definitively say, yes, this was a mistake made at the time the action was taken because they should have known.
Exactly. That lack of systematic real-time tracking is the core issue the GAO points to regarding the data's precision on this specific question. Now, let's switch gears slightly to detainers. Remember, an ICE detainer is that request they send to, say, a local jail or state prison. When they think someone held there is a potentially removable foreign national, they ask the jail to hold the person for up to 48 hours so ICE can come pick them up.
Okay, so what did the data show about detainers issued for people who might be U.S. citizens?
All right, so for that same period, FY 2015 through early 2020, ICE issued detainers for at least 895 individuals where their ERO data indicated potential U.S. citizenship. And they issued detainers for over 1,800 people where the citizenship was listed as just unknown. Now, taken together, these were still a tiny fraction, less than 1% of all the detainers ICE issued overall.
And who were these potential citizens getting detainers? Any patterns?
Pretty similar demographics to the arrests and detentions, mostly males, ages 19 to 45. The detainers were most frequently issued within the Dallas and Los Angeles areas of responsibility, and typically the individuals were already in custody at state or county facilities when the detainer was lodged.
Okay, here's something that seems really striking from the summary. Of those 895 detainers for people with potential U.S. citizenship, a huge chunk were canceled later, like 3/4.
Yes, that's right. At least 665 of those 895 detainers were eventually canceled. That's about 74%. And the most common reason listed in the system for the cancellation was simply not subject to deportation.
Which could imply citizenship was confirmed, right? But maybe not explicitly stated.
It could imply that. However, the report again adds a note of caution. ICE guidance at the time didn't actually tell officers which specific cancellation code to use if they did identify U.S. citizenship. And same issue as before, the data doesn't tell us when the detainer was canceled relative to when that potential citizenship might have been figured out. Was it canceled quickly or after the person sat for a while? We don't know from the data.
Okay, so beyond ICE and CBP's own internal records, did GAO look at complaints, people raising their hands saying this happened to them?
They did. They looked at complaint data from 2 internal watchdog offices within DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. There's the DHS Office of Inspector General, OIG, and the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, known as CRCL. For that same time frame, fiscal 2015 through early 2020, the OIG received 130 complaints from people claiming to be U.S. citizens who said they were subject to enforcement actions. Detention by ICE was the most common complaint.
And CRCL. Similar findings.
Pretty similar, yeah. CRCL got 74 complaints along those lines. Again, mostly about being detained by ICE. CRCL also apparently opened up 5 records on its own based on media reports they saw about alleged U.S. citizens being caught up in the system.
All right, so after looking at policies, training, data, detainers, complaints, all of it, what did the GAO conclude? What do they recommend?
Well, based on everything they found, the inconsistencies in training, the big data limitations, but also the actual instances they could identify in the data and complaints, GAO made 2 specific recommendations directly to DHS, which oversees both ICE and CBP.
Okay, what were they?
First, they recommended that ICE needs to update its training materials. Make sure the training actually aligns with the official written policy about getting supervisors involved when officers encounter someone who might be a U.S. citizen. Basically, close that gap we talked about.
Makes sense. And the second recommendation?
Second, they recommended that ICE needs to figure out a way to systematically collect and maintain electronic data. Data specifically on those encounters where they find that probative evidence, that strong evidence of U.S. citizenship. The idea is that this would finally allow ICE to reliably track these instances, understand the scope, see trends, and manage the issue properly.
And DHS, did they push back or did they agree?
No, DHS agreed with both recommendations. They concurred. They told GAO they were taking steps or had plans in place to address them, things like updating the training materials. And they mentioned plans to update system user guides and procedures by, I think it was June 30, 2022, specifically to improve how they collect data on encounters involving identified U.S. citizens.
Okay, so let's try to pull all this together now. What's the big picture takeaway here? What does this GAO report fundamentally tell us about this issue?
Well, I think it tells us a few key things. It shows that the agencies involved, ICE and CBP, they do have policies intended to prevent U.S. citizens from getting mistakenly swept into the administrative immigration system, but There are real disconnects, inconsistencies between those policies and the actual training officers receive. And perhaps most importantly, there are really significant limitations in how the agencies, especially ICE, but also CBP and Border Patrol to some extent, track these specific situations in their data systems.
Right. And because of those data problems, it means that even though the numbers they could identify potential citizens arrested, detained, getting detainers removed, seem relatively small compared to the millions of enforcement actions overall.
Exactly. While the identifiable numbers are small percentages, the report absolutely confirms that there are instances where individuals eventually identified as potential U.S. citizens were subjected to these processes. But, and it's a big but, because of those data limitations GAO highlighted, like ICE not systematically flagging encounters with strong citizenship evidence, or CBP Border Patrol data not isolating administrative charges for citizens, the true scale, the actual frequency with which U.S. citizens are mistakenly processed using procedures only meant for foreign nationals, well, it's just not fully captured by the data systems as they existed. We don't know the full extent.
And this matters to you, our listener. Why? Because fundamentally, administrative immigration enforcement has a very specific target: non-citizens who are here in violation of immigration law, making sure the government's processes work correctly, that they accurately determine and respect a person's citizenship status. That's absolutely foundational. It's about preventing U.S. citizens from being wrongly subjected to a system of procedures that simply should not apply to them.
Yeah, it really boils down to the integrity of the process and protecting the fundamental rights that come with being a U.S. citizen.
Exactly. So maybe here's a final thought for you to consider, based on everything we've just unpacked from this GAO report. Given how genuinely complex determining citizenship can be in some cases, and coupling that with these data tracking challenges that the government's own watchdog agency identified, what other steps, what further checks or balances might actually be needed to build a system that could truly guarantee that no U.S. citizen ever gets mistakenly caught up in these administrative immigration enforcement processes? Something to think about long after our deep dive today.